Yo, what's up guys? Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for the Brothers War, going over any cards that I think have the potential to see play in Historic or Explorer. So what I've done, rather than going through the entire set, which would take ages and be pretty boring, I've basically just gone through the entire spoiler and picked out any cards that I think have the potential to see play in Historic or Explorer. This set is also getting Retro Frame artifacts, which are basically like a subset within the set that are going to be in the booster packs, and they're going to be Historic legal but not Explorer legal, kind of similar to Strixhaven's Mystical Archive, if you remember that. So as I'm going through the set, if any of those cards come up, I'll let you know, just so you know which sets they're going to, which formats they're going to be legal in. I'm also going to be putting up some texts set reviews on MTGAZone. I've already done a set review going over every single new Retro Frame artifact and what I think about them in Historic. So that'll be going up soon. I'll link that down in the description in case you want to check that out. And I'm also going to be doing a text write-up about a lot of these cards that I'm going to be talking about now, probably going into a little bit more detail, maybe talking about lists that I think they could see potential in. So if you're interested in reading more of a text-based version of what I'm going to talk about here, I'll link both of those in the description once they go up on the website. But anyway, let's just go straight into it. Starting off here with Diabolic Intent. This is a 2-mana sorcery, costs 1 colourless and a black, and as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature, and you get to search your library for a card, put that card into your hand, then shuffle. So this is obviously a very powerful effect. Getting an unconditional tutor for 2 mana is very, very powerful, especially in combo decks. Now, the fact you do have to sacrifice a creature to pay for this does mean that if you want to run high numbers of this, if you want to run 3 or 4 copies, I think you do need to be running it in a creature-heavy deck. So, like I said, I think combo is the main place you want to be running this because it allows you to tutor up any combo piece that you're missing. And because of the restriction, I think you mainly want to be running this in creature-based combo decks. So, in Explorer, the first place that I thought of when I saw this card was Abzan Greasefang. In Pioneer, there are Abzan Greasefang decks that are running Eldritch Evolution to consistently tutor up the Greasefang. In Explorer, we obviously don't have access to Eldritch Evolution, so I think this is a good replacement there. Being able to sacrifice a Stitches Supplier or a Rafine's Informant in order to tutor up Greasefang seems very powerful. In general, in Greasefang, I think Eldritch Evolution is probably the more desirable card because it tutors Greasefang immediately onto the battlefield, which means it's a bit faster, you're less vulnerable to discard spells. But the big upside of Diabolic Intent is that it also enables you to tutor up non-creatures, and it allows you to keep them in your hand as well. So the really nice thing about this card when you're building the deck is that it allows you to run a lot of silver bullets. So you can run a lot of one-offs in the deck that you can tutor up with Diabolic Intent to get you out of sticky situations. And in particular as well, it also allows you to run a lot of one-offs in your sideboard, which is really nice. So the ability to run silver bullets with this card, especially if you're able to run 4 copies, is really nice. In terms of Historic, like I said again, I think you're mainly interested in running this in creature-based combo decks, and the first deck that came to mind for me was the Jund Combo Goblins deck. So that's a deck that's looking to assemble Putrid Goblin alongside Metallic Mimic or Grumgully the Generous, which then enables you to infinitely sack Putrid Goblin, either to get infinite mana off Skirk Prospector or to drain the opponent infinitely with Slingang Lieutenant. And I think this is going to be a perfect addition to that deck. That's a deck that could potentially run Goblin Trapfinder. I think this card is really, really strong with Goblin Trapfinder because you can play Trapfinder on turn 1, sack it on turn 2 to Diabolic Intent. You get to see which card you get off the Trapfinder first, which then helps inform the search you get off the Diabolic Intent. And there are also a lot of other goblins in the deck that you're pretty happy to sacrifice as well. So I think this will be a great addition there. And just in general, any creature-based combo deck that can afford to run black, I think this is going to be a great addition. Even outside of combo decks, I think this also does have the potential to see play in more fair sacrifice decks. I think this is a really strong sacrifice payoff. Red-Black Sacrifice is already a pretty decent deck in Explorer, and I think this could be a good addition there, allowing you to run these, like I said, silver bullet one-offs, stuff like Shieldred. You could run Bolus's Citadel as a one-off to give you combo burst. If you're running green, you could run, Corvold, and then, I think the big advantage of this is being able to run more narrow silver bullet sideboard cards that you can tutor with this. So this is definitely a card that I expect to see a lot of play both in Explorer and Historic. Next up, we've got Brotherhood's End, and I expect this one to be pretty format defining, especially in Historic. So this is a 3-mana sorcery, and you choose one. Either it deals 3 damage to each creature and each planeswalker, or you get to destroy all artifacts with mana value 3 or less. So in Explorer, I think this is going to be nice because it gives you better game against stuff like the Anvil decks, but the main place I'm really excited for this card is Historic, because right now in Historic, 2 of the top decks in the format are Red-White Thopters and Blue-White Affinity, Both of these decks are built almost entirely around artifacts, and even now, before the Brotherhood's End is released, a lot of decks are running mass artifact removal. You know, white decks are running stuff like Divine Purge or Heliod's Intervention in the sideboard, and red decks already have access to Bifrost or Shatterstorm, which a lot of decks are running. And the really big advantage of this over something like Bifrost or Shatterstorm is that it's a lot more it's less narrow, basically. You know, the big downside of running Bifrost or Shatterstorm in your sideboard, especially if you're running a deck like Rakdos midrange where you're kind of pushed for space in the sideboard, is that Shatterstorm and Bifrost are very narrow in their effects. They're only really good against Affinity or Thopters, whereas this card is really, really good in both of those matchups, you know, especially against the red-white Thopters deck, because their whole deck is mana value 3 or less because of Luris. Still incredibly good against the blue-white Affinity deck. You know, the only thing that this really misses is Thought Monitor, and this is just going to be a really big upgrade in those decks, because not only does it work as mass artifact removal, and it's more efficient than Shatterstorm at that as well, but it also acts as just a 3-mana, 3-damage sweeper, which is very good against any of the go wide decks as well, you know, like Elves, Merfolk, Goblins. So this is going to be a really format-defining card, I think. You know, I expect to see this in the sideboard of almost every red deck if Affinity and Thopters continue to be popular, and I also expect it to see play in the main deck of a lot of decks that can afford to run main deck sweepers like this as well. So I expect this to be really format defining. One other thing that's worth noting is that it doesn't destroy artifacts with mana value 4 or greater, kind of similar to Divine Purge. So if artifacts do continue to be a pretty big part of the format, which I think they might be because this set is full of very powerful artifacts, then I think artifacts with mana value 4 or greater are going to be pretty valuable because they dodge the Brotherhood's End. And next up we've got another similar card. This is Fade from History, so it's a 4-mana green sorcery. Each player who controls an artifact or enchantment creates a 2/2 green bear creature token, then destroy all artifacts and enchantments. So this is really powerful because it now gives green access to mass artifact removal. Now green does have access to some mass artifact removal. I think there's Rampage of the Clans, but that doesn't really work if you're trying to sweep the board of a Thopters or Affinity opponent, because they get a bunch of 3/3s instead, whereas this just essentially acts as just a hoser against those sorts of decks. And this is really big because right now, if you're in red or white, you have access to really good options for mass artifact removal. Green didn't really have that. You know, green does have access to a lot of single target artifact removal, but now they're going to have access to mass artifact removal, which is going to be really difficult, especially for a deck like red-white Thopters. With the addition of Fade from History and Brotherhood's End to Historic, I expect red-white Thopters to kind of fall off a bit because they really don't have a good way to play around this. You know, the best options that they have are like stuff like Mana Tithe or Teferi's Protection, neither of which are really good. Whereas the blue-white Affinity deck, at least they have access to counter spells like Metallic Rebuke, Dovin's Veto, or potentially, you know, Disruption Protocol or something like that. So with the addition of these two cards, I do expect them both to see play, mainly in sideboards, and I do expect red-white Thopters to kind of fall off with the addition of these. I still think blue-white Affinity has more resilience and better options to deal with this, but I think both this and Brotherhood's End are going to have a really big impact on Historic. Again, I'm not sure this is really going to have much impact in Explorer. Oh, one other thing as well, I think Enchantress is in an interesting spot right now in Historic because 9 lives plus Solemnity, a lot of the top decks can't beat right now. You know, Rakdos Goblins has Sling Lieutenant, and some decks are going to be running some enchantment removal. But if green decks start running this in the sideboard, that's going to be kind of the death nail in the 9 lives Enchantress. The 9 lives Solemnity Enchantress deck as well. So I do expect Fade from History and Brotherhood's End to have a pretty big impact on the format. Next up, we've got Monastery Swiftspear. This is a 1-mana 1/2 with haste and prowess. So this is a card that people have been asking to be added to the format for a while. I think a lot of people were disappointed when this wasn't added in the Explorer Anthology. And so now we have it in the format, both in Explorer and Historic. And I expected to see a good amount of play in both of them. So this is going to be run in burn decks, in heroic decks, in potentially the Izzet kind of frenzy decks as well. This is just a super efficient threat that really pays you off for running a bunch of spells alongside it. And so yeah, I expect this to see a lot of play in both formats. I'm not sure how well positioned the decks that Swiftspear goes in is going to be, but this is just such a great addition to a lot of the decks in both formats. So I'm excited to play with this one. And, you know, there's a chance that decks like Burn, Heroic, or Izzet Blitz become more popular because of this addition. Next up, we've got Phyrexian Dragon Engine. So this is a 3-mana artifact creature. So 2/2 with double strike, and when it enters the battlefield from your graveyard, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw 3 cards, and it has Unearth for 5. So the main reason that I'm excited for this card is because of Goblin Engineer. So Goblin Engineer, very powerful card in Historic. I'm not really excited for this card in Explorer unless I'm missing some powerful interaction with it. But in Historic, where we have access to Goblin Engineer, we can put this in our graveyard off the ETB, which alone, even if the Goblin Engineer gets killed, you still get a decent amount of value because you can unearth it for 5 mana later in the game, which is decent. But the main thing I'm really interested in here is that if the Goblin Engineer lives and you're running it in a deck with other artifacts, you can start using the Engineer to keep looping it. You know, you sacrifice an artifact to the Engineer, get back the Dragon Engine from your graveyard, and then discard your hand and draw 3 cards, which is super powerful. You know, if the opponent can't get rid of your Engineer, you're essentially going to be drawing 3 cards every other turn. If you can sacrifice the Dragon Engine to something else, then you can potentially get it back every single turn with Engineer, which seems really, really powerful. So this is definitely an interaction that I'm going to be trying out. And, you know, Goblin Engineer is already a powerful card, and it's going to work with one other card that I'm going to talk about in a second as well. But this interaction seems very, very strong to me. And I'm excited to build around this. So another card that works really well with Goblin Engineer that we're getting in the set is Sword of the Meek. So this is a 2-mana artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+2, has equip 2, and whenever a 1/1 creature you control enters the battlefield, you may return Sword of the Meek from your graveyard to the battlefield, then attach it to that creature. So this is the first card that is going to be in the Retro Frame artifact set. So this isn't going to be legal in Explorer, but it will be legal in Historic. And this is a really nice one to ditch with the Goblin Engineer as well, if you're running only Cull Anvil. Now, unfortunately, we don't have Thopter Foundry, which is the main combo with this in older formats. There is a way to go infinite. I can't remember the name of the card. There's a black card that has Convoke and makes 1/1 tokens whenever artifacts die. So if you have that with this and a free sacrifice outlet for artifacts, you can go infinite with this, making infinite 1/1s, but that seems quite difficult to set up. So the main place I'm excited to try Sword of the Meek is in an only Cull Anvil shell. So Anvil is, you know, already a fairly, well, it's not super popular in Historic, but it's a powerful engine. And with Goblin Engineer and Sword of the Meek, you know, you can play Goblin Engineer, run Sword of the Meek as a one-of, and then you can just ditch it into the graveyard. And then with only Cull Anvil, whenever you make a 1/1 token, you get Sword of the Meek back, turn that 1/1 into a 2/3, and then you can just sacrifice the Sword of the Meek to only Cull Anvil, get another 1/1 and just bring it back. So only Cull Anvil, Sword of the Meek basically means that you're always going to have sacrifice fodder to Anvil, which is really nice. And you know, Anvil in general, I could also see running with Goblin Engineer and a one-off Phyrexian Dragon Engine as well. You know, Anvil generally wants you to be playing a very low to the ground deck, so you can just empty your hand, you know, get Goblin Engineer, pitch Dragon Engine, or pitch Sword of the Meek, and then if you have Dragon Engine and Engineer, you can just start sacrificing your Anvil tokens to get back the Engineer, draw 3 cards. So I'm really excited to build a deck around these shells. And another card that I think also will work well with only Cull Anvil is Chromatic Star. So this is another one that is going to be in the Retro Frame artifact set. So this again is going to be legal in Historic but not Explorer. So this is a 1-mana artifact, and you can pay 1 and tap it, sacrifice Chromatic Star to add 1 mana of any color, and then when it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you get to draw a card. So this is very similar to a card we already have in Historic, which is Chromatic Sphere. This is a card that already sees play in combo decks like Kethis and Paradox Engine. The main differences between the two cards is, first of all, Chromatic Sphere can't be responded to because it's a mana ability. So if you pay 1 and tap it and sacrifice it, you get the draw immediately, and the opponent doesn't get a chance to respond to it because it's a mana ability. Now that is largely going to be completely irrelevant. The only time I've ever seen that come up is against Tainted Pack decks. If you have if you have Jace, Wielder of Mysteries on the battlefield and you have an empty library, Chromatic Sphere allows you to draw, so you win the game with Jace and the opponent doesn't get a chance to respond to it to kill the Jace. That's the only time I've ever seen it come up in Historic. The other main difference is that you get the card draw on Chromatic Star if this is sacrificed or destroyed by another card, which is very relevant for only Cull Anvil. So, you know, say we have Chromatic Star in play, we can sacrifice it to the Oni Occult Anvil and still get the card draw, which is really big because I think the 1-mana enablers for Oni Occult Anvil in Historic that enable you to sacrifice them on turn 2 are pretty mediocre. You know, you've got Terrarian and Implement of Combustion, which are both not great, whereas Chromatic Star is actually pretty decent. Again, you could sacrifice this to a Deadly Dispute and get the card draw as well, so that's somewhere else that I expect it to see play as well. The downside of Chromatic Star is that it needs to go to the graveyard to get the card draw, so if the opponent has something like a Rest in Peace or a Leyline of the Void in play, then you don't get the card draw. So I think in decks that are already running Chromatic Sphere, like Paradox Engine and Kethis combo, those are both decks that already struggle to beat Graveyard Hate, so I think they would probably prefer to play Chromatic Sphere out of the two, because you can still draw if the opponent has a Rest in Peace or Leyline of the Void in play, but there are potentially decks that might want to run more than 4 copies of this effect, so having Sphere in addition to Star is very nice. And like I said, any deck that is interested in sacrificing artifacts like Oni Occult Anvil, I think this is going to be a great addition. I think Chromatic Star is going to be a great addition to those sorts of decks as well. Next up we've got Altar of Dementia. So this is a 2-mana artifact, and you can sacrifice a creature to make target player mill cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. So this is really powerful because it's essentially a free sacrifice outlet for 2 mana, which is already powerful in and of itself. You know, in Historic we don't have great free sacrifice outlets. We're also getting Ashnod's Altar in this set, which I don't think is as powerful as Altar of Dementia, because the really good thing about Altar of Dementia is it essentially acts as a win condition in and of itself, because if you have a combo where you can go infinite by sacrificing something, you know, like the Putrid Goblin combo deck that I talked about earlier, where you can just go infinite if you have a free sacrifice outlet. This just works as a win condition because you can just mill the opponent out. You know, say you have Putrid Goblin and Metallic Mimic, you can just repeatedly sacrifice Putrid Goblin to Altar of Dementia just to mill the opponent out and win. Now, in the Goblins deck, I'm not sure I would run this personally because I'd probably want to run stuff like Runveld Hoardmaster, and I think Skirk Prospector and Slingang Lieutenant, being Goblins, helps to enable a plan B in the deck where you can just play more of a fair Goblin game plan, and running more Goblins means that you're going to get better hits off Runveld Hoardmaster and stuff like that. So I'm not 100% sure this is going to see play in that deck, but there are a bunch of other potential combos where you can go infinite with a free sacrifice outlet, like Vespelark and Body Double is a way to go infinite with a free sacrifice outlet. So this, I feel like, I'm not sure how much play this is going to see immediately, but if there's ever a combo deck that's good that requires a free sacrifice outlet, this is just going to be the perfect payoff for those sorts of decks, because it's really cheap and it just wins you the game basically immediately when you start sacrificing stuff as well, which is huge. Oh, by the way, this is from the Retro Artifact Archive, so this is not going to be legal in Explorer, but it will be in Historic. Same with Defense Grid. So this is another card that's from the Retro Frame Artifact set, and this is a 2-mana artifact, and each spell costs 3 more to cast except during its controller's turn. So basically this card is going to be a really nice card in the sideboard of combo decks. So this alongside the Altar of Dementia, this is going to be another card that is very good in combo decks, because it basically just says that the opponent can't interact with you during your turn unless they pay 3 extra for all of their spells. So it basically just means that you're much more likely to be able to go off during your turn. I think this is going to be basically an auto-include in every single combo deck in the sideboard. They're going to be very, very good against decks like Control. Going to be very good against decks that are relying on instant speed interaction to try and break up your combo. Now, it is an artifact, and there is going to be a decent amount of artifact removal in the set, but I still think this is just going to be a slam dunk in combo sideboards. So this is definitely going to be a boost for those sorts of decks. Speaking of combo, Goblin Charbelcher, another card from the Retro Artifact set. So again, this is going to be legal in Historic but not Explorer. And this card single-handedly will potentially enable a new combo deck in the format, which is pretty exciting. So this is a 4-mana artifact, and you can pay 3 and tap it to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land card. Goblin Charbelcher deals damage equal to the number of non-land cards revealed this way to any target, and if the revealed land card was a mountain, it deals double damage instead. Put the revealed cards in the bottom of your library in any order. So basically the way you build Goblin Charbelcher decks is you don't run any actual lands in your mana base. You basically just build your entire mana base using the modal double face lands, modal double face cards from Zendikar, which basically they don't count as lands until they enter the battlefield. So if you run stuff like Shatterskull Smashing or Spikefield Hazard as your mana base, when you activate the Goblin Charbelcher, it will essentially just go through your entire deck and just one-shot the opponent out of nowhere. So that's a really potentially powerful effect. And And it'll be interesting to see whether this deck's good, because there are a few ways that you can build it. I think Ironcrag Feet is going to be a staple in this deck because, you know, you pay 4 mana to get 7, which is exactly the amount of mana you need to both play Goblin Charbelcher and activate it in the same turn, which is pretty huge. And then outside of that, you know, how you build the rest of the deck just depends on how you want to go with it. I think having redundancy for this sort of effect, you know, having ways to tutor the Goblin Charbelcher is going to be really huge, and there are a number of ways that you can do that. You could run Khan the Great Creator, running your 4th copy of Charbelcher in your sideboard to tutor with the Khan. You could run Indomitable Creativity, you know, with non-artifacts that produce artifact tokens like Strike It Rich or Hard Evidence. You could just run looting effects to get it. You could run Goblin Engineer and Trash for Treasure to get it back from the graveyard if you wanted to. So there's a lot of different ways that you could build the deck. I'm definitely going to be trying it out. I'm not 100% sure if it will be good enough because it is going to be weak to discard spells. It is going to be weak to counter spells. And being, you know, having to run your mana base just full of modal double face lands means that you are going to have to run a decent amount of tap lands. And the format is also quite aggressive in general, you know. Is it Wizards is still going to be a good deck? I think Red-White Thopters. I mean, I still think Thopters is probably going to be have a rough time with the mass artifact removal, but in general, the format is quite aggressive, so there's a chance that Charbelcher decks might just be too slow in general, but it's a cool new card, and I'm definitely going to be trying building around it myself. Next up, we've got Howling Mine. So again, this is another card from the Retro Artifact. It's going to be legal in Historic, but not Explorer. 2 mana artifact. At the beginning of each player's draw step, if Howling Mine is untapped, that player draws an additional card. So this is a really powerful effect if you can break the symmetry on it. I think if you're just making both players draw a card each turn, it's pretty bad. It's not really worth it. But if you can tap it or just stop the opponent from drawing an extra card, it's going to be a way that you're just going to run away with the game. So the main way that you can tap this to stop the opponent drawing a card is with Moonsnare Prototype. So that's a card that's already running Affinity. The other main card that I can think of as a way to break the symmetry on this is Narset Parter of Veils. So if you have a Narset in play, obviously the opponent can't draw more than 1 card each turn, which then stops the opponent getting a benefit from that. So you could potentially run kind of like an offshoot on Blue-White Affinity, where you run Howling Mine alongside Moonsnare Prototype, and you can keep tapping the Howling Mine with the Prototype to stop the opponent from drawing. You can also run Narset to try and maximise the chances of breaking the symmetry on this. Now, I think Blue-White Affinity is already a deck that is, you know, it's hard to fit everything that you want into the deck, so I'm not sure whether this is going to be better than the builds we already have. And, you know, I think it's going to be hard to fit everything in if you start running Narset as well, but I definitely think it's worth trying. If you can break the symmetry on this, it's a very, very powerful effect for 2 mana. Next up, we've got another one from the Retro Artifacts, and this is Lodestone Golem. So this is a 4-mana artifact, 5/3, and non-artifact spells cost 1 more to cast. So this is another really powerful payoff in artifact decks, especially if you can ramp into this. If you can ramp into this early, you know, on turn 3, for example, it's a very powerful effect, essentially taxing everything in your opponent's deck unless they're also running artifacts. The fact that this is 4 mana is also particularly relevant with Brotherhood's End being released. You know, like I said earlier, Divine Purge and Brotherhood's End only hitting artifacts up to mana value 3 or, you know, mana value 4 or higher basically dodges those. So if this does see play, I think a big reason why it's good is that it dodges a lot of the mass artifact removal. Now, again, you do need to be able to ramp into this. We are getting Springleaf Drum in the set, which I'll talk about a bit later. So there is potentially, you know, an artifact deck where you could run Moonsnare Prototype and Springleaf Drum as a way to ramp into this early. But I think, you know, one of the main issues with this card, similar to Thalia, is that it's a card that gets a lot worse as the game goes on. You know, if you draw this late in the game and the opponent already has access to a lot of mana, this doesn't really do that much. But if you can ramp into this, if you can consistently get this down on turn 3, it does have the potential to be very powerful. On the flip side, the other drawback of this is that the artifact decks already have a lot of pretty decent plays at the 4-drop slot. I think both of the Khan Planeswalkers are very powerful, both Scion of Urza and especially Khan the Great Creator, because it's getting a lot of new additions to the wish board that I'll be going over a little bit later in the video. So I think, you know, there is a lot of competition in the artifact deck in general. There's a lot of competition at the 4-drop slot, but I do think this is a card that does have potential. So I could see it seeing play. I'm going to test it out, but I'm not 100% sure on this one personally. Next up, we've got Phyrexian Revoker. So again, another card from the Retro Artifact set. 2 mana, 2/1, and as it enters the battlefield, you choose a non-land card name. Activated abilities of the chosen card name can't be activated. So this is essentially Pithing Needle on a creature. And Pithing Needle is already a card that sees play in sideboards. You know, there are some, you know, reasonable targets that are already played. You know, if you're not playing Retrofit a Foundry, you could name that. If you're playing an artifact-based deck, which you might do if you're running Phyrexian Revoker, you could name Goblin Trashmaster to stop the Goblins deck just blowing everything up that you've got. Obviously, against control, you can name their Planeswalkers as well. So this is a really nice addition to the format. I think the main reason that you would want to run this over Pithing Needle is if you're running a creature-heavy deck, because it then allows you to keep applying pressure. You know, if you're running a creature-based deck and you bring in Pithing Needle, that's a card that is going to slow down your clock. You're not going to be able to apply pressure with it. Whereas this can attack, and you can also hit it off stuff like Collected Company or Inquisitor Captain as well. So I'm not 100% sure this is going to see a ton of play immediately, but if decks prop up in future that are built around a lot of activated abilities, I could definitely see this seeing play in the sideboard of Collected Company decks, for example. Next up, we've got Springleaf Drum. Again, this is another one from the Retro Artifact set, so not going to be legal in Explorer. Well, actually, ignore that. It will be legal in Explorer, sorry. This is basically the only one, or one of the only ones that will be legal in Explorer because it's already legal in Pioneer. So anyway, this is a 1-mana artifact, and you can tap it and tap an untapped creature you control to add 1 mana of any colour. So this is kind of similar to Moonsnare Prototype, but in general, I think it's largely better, specifically in the Affinity deck as well, because the big problem with Moonsnare Prototype is that it can only make colourless mana, which often means, you know, if you're playing a blue-white Affinity deck, you can't cast your 1-drops like Esper Sentinel, you know, you can't cast any coloured spells with Moonsnare Prototype off the mana, whereas this allows you to produce mana of any colour, which is really huge. I think it's going to be big because it allows you to keep up Metallic Rebuke more easily. It allows you to have starts where you go like turn 1 Springleaf Drum, Ornithopter, tap the Ornithopter to pay for Esper Sentinel, for example. So in general, I think this is just going to be an upgrade in the blue-white Affinity deck. You know, Moonsnare Prototype does have the upside of being able to tap artifacts, and it does have the upside of having the channel ability as well, and there's a chance that you might run them both together as well. But I think in general, Springleaf Drum is going to be the better card. It's going to be a straight upgrade for those decks just because it helps to fix your mana and just enables you to cast more spells in the same turn. The mana fixing could potentially mean that you could maybe get away with running a three color Affinity deck as well, because you also have Spire of Industry in the mana base. And like I said, you could run Springleaf Drum alongside Moonsnare Prototype and like multiple Thought Monitors and, you know, just top end cards to help you refuel to enable you to swarm the battlefield quickly. So this is going to be a great addition to Affinity, and there are also some other decks that might be interested in this, like Paradox Engine as well. So this is a really great addition, and Affinity decks will definitely appreciate this one, I think. Next up, we've got Thorn of Amethyst. So this is a 2-mana artifact. Non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. So again, this is going to be a card that is only going to be legal in Historic because it's from the Retro Artifact set. And I think this is a really interesting card because it basically gives non-white creature decks access to a Thalia style effect. I'm not sure white decks would run this over Thalia because, you know, similar to what I was saying with the Phyrexian Revoker earlier, in an aggro deck, you generally want to be playing creatures so that you can continue to apply pressure while still having the taxing effects. But I think non-white aggressive decks will definitely appreciate this as a sideboard card against control or other decks that rely on chaining a bunch of non-creature spells together, like Wizards or Auras, for example. So if this is going to see play, I think it's mainly going to be in the sideboard of creature-heavy non-white decks, if that makes sense, but still a great addition to the format, and I definitely see this seeing play in some sideboards. Next up, I want to talk about Khan the Great Creator, because this is a card that doesn't really see much play in either Explorer or Historic. There are obviously green ramp decks in Explorer, not as powerful as the Pioneer versions because we don't have Nykthos yet, and it does occasionally see play in Historic in like some Affinity decks to try and help in the mirror match, but we're getting a bunch of new artifacts that give Khan more tools in its wishboard that I'm going to go over next. So these next cards are cards that I don't really expect to see play in the main deck, but they're really great additions to the Khan wishboard that could potentially mean this card sees more play in both formats going forward. So the first one is Liquimetal Coating. Again, this is from the Retro Artifact set, so this is not going to be legal in Explorer, but it will be in Historic. 2-mana artifact. Tap it, target permanent becomes an artifact in addition to its other types until the end of turn. So this is a really powerful card with Khan the Great Creator, because if you're in a position where you can defend Khan, you can grab the Liquimetal Coating, tap it to turn the opponent's land into an artifact, and then you can use Khan's +1 to turn that land into a creature with 0 toughness, which essentially kills it. So if you can get Liquimetal Coating and you can defend Khan, you can essentially just Stone Rain one of your opponent's lands every single turn, which is a really, really strong way to kind of push your advantage if you're in a position, if you're in a position where you can defend Khan, this will just essentially close out the game as, the turns go on. So this is a really great addition there. It does also enable a combo with Saheeli Rai. There's Saheeli Rai and Luxior was a combo previously where you could repeatedly use Saheeli's -2 on itself. You can do a similar thing with Liquimetal Coating where you turn Saheeli into an artifact and you can repeatedly -2 on itself, and if you have a Reckless Fireweaver that deals infinite damage. But I tested that deck with Luxior and it didn't feel, it felt quite clunky to me, so I'm not sure this is really going to make a difference there. But just in the Khan Wishboard of being able to Stone Rain the opponent's lands, I think this is a really interesting addition. Next up we've got Cityscape Leveler. So this is an 8-mana artifact creature with trample, and when you cast this, and whenever it attacks, destroy up to one target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a tapped Power Stone. So this is probably going to compete for the slot with Meteor Golem. So Meteor Golem is just a 7-mana creature you could get out of the Calm Wishboard to destroy any non-land permanent. Now, this is obviously 1 mana more, which might mean that Meteor Golem edges it out, but the fact that you can repeatedly destroy stuff with this is pretty huge. Oftentimes with Meteor Golem, you'd get it and destroy 1 permanent, and then you'd kind of want that effect again. This, for just 1 mana more, you get to destroy permanent. Obviously, the opponent does get a Power Stone token, but I think that's largely going to be irrelevant in most cases. But then if you get to untap with it and attack again, it'll just start running away with the game. And just for a single card, this represents a lot of ways to deal with problematic permanents. So I could see this replacing Meteor Golem in Khan Wishboards, which is interesting. And next up, we've got the Stasis Coffin. So this is a 3-mana legendary artifact. You can pay 2 and tap it, exile the Stasis Coffin, and you gain protection from everything until your next turn. So this is a card that a lot of people were talking about, and I wanted to bring it up because it was getting a lot of hype with Khan, but I'm not actually sure this is that great, really. And considering the number of new cards we're getting in the Khan Wishboards, in addition to all the options we already have, I'm not sure this is really going to see that much play. The big issue with this is that it doesn't protect Khan, so you can fetch this as a way to protect yourself from a combo. For example, if the opponent is playing a combo deck, you can just get this and then activate it to stop the combo from killing you. Or if you're facing down lethal damage, you can get this to stop the opponent from just attacking you directly. But the issue with this is that if you do get this against a combo deck, almost all of the combo decks in Historic are able to, or even Explorer, are able to just go off again the next turn. So while this does buy you a turn, it's not, unless you draw an answer to their combo that turn, it's not really going to help you. And again, on the flip side, if you're getting this to protect you from being attacked for lethal, the opponent's just going to attack down the Khan instead. And again, all it does is really buy you 1 turn. Now, the powerful thing about this is it does exile itself, which means you can grab it from the sideboard multiple times, but like I said, it doesn't protect Khan itself, so the opponent's going to be able to attack it down, and you have to minus to get this every single time as well, so it's not like you can loop it either. So this could potentially see play if, combo decks that use Grape Shot, for example, are very popular, because then you can just grab this, force the opponent to go off, force them to use up their Grape Shot, and then you can activate it to protect yourself, and then you force the opponent to get, they have to then get another Grape Shot to win. But most combo decks aren't reliant on Grape Shot, so I'm not really sure this is going to make the cut personally, but definitely worth bearing in mind in future. Another one is the Stone Brain. So this is a 2-mana legendary artifact, and you can pay 2 and tap it, exile the Stone Brain, choose a card name, search target opponent's graveyard, hand, and library for up to 4 cards with that name and exile them. That player shuffles their library, then draws a card for each card exiled this way. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is essentially a kind of Necromentia, Unmoored Ego style effect that you can tutor up off Khan the Great Creator. In general, I don't think those cards are particularly good, because in most cases, if you use those sort of effect, the opponent is going to have other ways to win the game, so you're kind of just wasting your turn, really. But as a tutorable target off Khan, I could see this being useful. If the opponent is playing a combo deck, you can use this to get rid of their main piece. If the opponent is playing a particularly problematic card against your deck, say you're against a control deck and you're really worried about Farewell, for example, this is a card that you could get to grab there. So even though I'm not very high on Necromentia Unmoored Ego style effects in general, having this as a tutorable target with Khan that you can also loop, because you can, it exiles itself, so you can then grab it again with Khan to get another card. Now again, you have to minus to get it, so it's not like you can just loop it every single turn, but the fact you can use it multiple times is pretty appealing. So I definitely think this could be something that's worth running, especially if there's a lot of combo decks in the format. Next up, we've got Wurmcoil Engine. Again, this is another retro artifact card, so not legal in Explorer, but 6-mana artifact creature with Death Touch and Lifelink, and when it dies, you get a 3/3 with Death Touch and a 3/3 with Lifelink. So this is obviously a pretty iconic card, and it is a very, very powerful card, especially against aggressive decks at stabilizing. But I'm not really sure there's going to be any decks in Historic that are interested in running this in the main deck, outside of maybe like Forsaken Monument decks, which I, in general, don't think are very well positioned at the moment and haven't been for a while anyway. So I'm not really sure this is going to see much play in Historic. Again, you know, there are occasionally ramp decks in Historic, but this is going to be competing with Elder Gargaroth, which I think is probably a bit better because it's just cheaper. But in the Karn Wishboard, I think this is a great option to have. You know, being able to grab this, play it for 6 mana against an aggressive deck is often going to be good enough to stabilize you. So while I don't think this is going to really see play in the main deck, I do think this is going to be a really nice option in the Karn Wishboard. Next up we've got Sundering Titan. So this is an 8-mana artifact creature. When it enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, choose a land of each basic land type, then destroy those lands, and it's a 7/10. So this is a very, very powerful card. And, you know, I think it could see play in the Karn Wishboard. It is a very powerful effect, but I'm not really that convinced. I wanted to bring it up because a lot of people are excited about this card. I think it's another card that's quite iconic, but you know, like I said, there's going to be a ton of new options for the Karn Wishboard. There's already a lot of decent existing options already. If you're playing Karn in best of 3, you also probably want some slots for regular sideboard cards as well. So I'm not, while this is a powerful card and like a really cool effect, I'm not really sure this is going to make the cut personally, just because there's a lot of good options. And if you're playing best of 3, you probably want some actual sideboard cards as well. But it's worth noting, you know, if domain decks or, you know, 5-color Niv decks become super popular, then maybe, but you know, 8 mana is a lot, so I'm not really sure this is going to see much play. And then finally, before I get into the more speculative cards, I do want to talk about the Pain lands. So we're getting the full set of Pain lands now with the addition of Brotherhood's War. So this is the red-white one. Essentially just a dual land where you can tap it for colorless or tap it for either its colors and deals 1 damage to you. So this is nice to see. You know, again, I'm not really sure it's going to see much play in Historic, apart from, or Explorer, apart from maybe in the colors that don't have fast lands. You know, if you're building an aggressive deck in the colors that don't have fast lands, then these could potentially see play there as well, which is nice. So this is just nice to round out that mana base, but again, it's not particularly exciting to talk about. So next up, I'm going to be talking about some other cards that I think have potential to see play, but I'm not 100% sure on. So first of all is Staff of Domination. So this is another card that is from the Retro Artifact set, so not going to be legal in Explorer, but has a lot of abilities. Pay 1 to untap it, pay 2 and tap it to gain the life, pay 3 and tap it to untap target creature, pay 4 and tap it to tap target creature, and pay 5 and tap it to draw a card. So this is a card that I think is pretty slow in general, but the main reason I'm excited for it is because if you pair this with a creature that is capable of tapping for a lot of mana, like Elvish Archdruid or Sanctum Weaver, you can potentially go infinite with it. So that's the main home that I'm excited for this card. If you can run this in an Elves deck, for example, and you can get Elvish Archdruid in play with 5, or have 5 elves in play alongside the Elvish Archdruid, you can go infinite because you can tap the Elvish Archdruid for 5 mana, untap it with the Staff of Domination, then untap the Staff of Domination for 1 mana, and then you're positive on 1 mana. You can just keep doing that over and over again, and then you can just draw through your whole deck. Now, this could be a nightmare to play on Arena, especially if you're only netting 1 mana every single time you do this loop, but it's definitely something that's worth bearing in mind because the ability to essentially go infinite in Elves is pretty powerful. I have been building a lot of different Elves deck over the past few months, and at some points, I've been testing Elves with Karn the Great Creator because typically I like to build Elves decks with 4 Elvish Archdruid and 4 Circle of Dreams Druid to try and maximize your fast wins by activating Allosaurus Shepherd or Elvish Warmaster early in the game. And so I did try builds where I was running Karn the Great Creator as an additional payoff for all the excess mana you get. And so you could potentially run Karn the Great Creator with Staff of Domination in the sideboard as a way to just pull and, you know, a way to win the game on the spot. If this is easy to set up, I could also potentially see this seeing play in the main deck, but I'm not sure how many copies you could really get away with running. So, you know, I'm definitely going to be trying out Elves with Karn the Great Creator and Staff of Domination because this seems like a powerful combo. In terms of with Sanctum Weaver, this does also go infinite with Sanctum Weaver as well, but in Enchantress, you typically don't really want to be running artifacts because it doesn't synergize particularly well. And in Enchantress, you also already have Gauntlets of Light, which goes infinite with Sanctum Weaver, and you can tutor Gauntlets of Light with Sterling Grove. So I'm not sure this is going to see play play there, but I could see this seeing play in Elves. It would be interesting to see whether that works or not. Next up, we've got Gwenna, Eyes of Gaea. So this is a 3-mana, 2/3 legendary creature. And you can tap it to add 2 mana of any combination of colours. Spend this mana only to cast creature spells or activate abilities of a creature card. And whenever you cast a creature spell with power 5 or greater, put a +1/+1 counter on it and untap it. So there are 2 main homes that I'm excited for this card. First of all is an Acererak combo. So Acererak combo is mainly a historic combo that is looking to go infinite with Acererak, either with Goblin Trap Finder or Relic of Legends. So if you sacrifice Goblin Trap Finder and you get Acererak, it essentially just costs 1 mana. Then if you have Acererak alongside Relic of Legends, you play the Acererak, get the Enter the Battlefield trigger, and then before it bounces back to your hand, you can tap it for black mana with Relic of Legends, allowing you to just loop it over and over again to get infinite dungeon triggers. You can also go infinite now with Gwenna. So Gwenna, you can use it to tap for 2 mana to pay for the Acererak, and then since Acererak is a 5/5, it will then untap the Gwenna and put a +1/+1 counter on it. So if you have any way to reduce the cost of Acererak just by 1, either by getting it off the Trap Finder or by having it alongside Relic of Legends, that's another way that you can go infinite with Acererak. Now, my issue with Acererak combo on Arena is that it's very difficult to pull off before the timer runs out, especially if you're just relying on draining the opponent out with one of the rooms. I think to go infinite and not time out, you would probably need to go through the leftmost room and win with something like Grape Shot, because, you know, on Arena, especially if you're playing in high stakes matches, the opponent is well within their rights just to make you play it out. And if you're relying on looping the opponent loses 1 life room every single time, I think you need like 80 dungeon loops to pull that off if the opponent's at 20 life or something, which you definitely don't have enough time to do on Arena. So if you can somehow figure out the timer issues with Acererak, then I think Gwenna is going to be a great addition to that deck. Additionally, because it's also a pretty decent hit off Trap Finder. If you hit this off Trap Finder, it only costs 1 mana and it has haste, so you can activate it to produce mana immediately, which is pretty nice as well. The other home that I'm excited for it in is Jodah the Unifier. So I've been trying out a bunch of different Jodah the Unifier decks. I think it's probably better suited to Explorer because it's a slightly slower format, but Jodah the Unifier is really powerful top end if you're running a legendary humans deck, and I think you can consistently cast this pretty early on because humans have access to Plaza of Heroes if you're running a bunch of legendaries, and you also have Unclaimed Territory and Concealed Courtyard as well. I think that's what it's called, the other tribal land. So you actually have pretty good mana for that. And so I've been trying a bunch of legendary humans decks in Explorer, and I felt like you just don't have enough good legendary humans that are worth running, and Gwenna seems like it would be a great addition to that deck because it allows you to single-handedly ramp into Jodah on turn 4, which is really powerful. And that, you know, you could also run stuff like Mox Amber to help you ramp into it even quicker. So I think if Gwenna does see play, it's either going to be in Acererak or in like a 5-color humans deck with Jodah. Speaking of 5-color humans with Jodah, I think a great addition to that deck is Hajar Loyal Bodyguards. This is a 2-mana legendary creature. It's a 3/3, and you can sacrifice it to give legendary creatures you control +1/+0 and indestructible until the end of turn. So, like I said, I think, you know, the legendary humans deck in Explorer just felt like it was missing quality pieces, and Hajar just seems the perfect addition to that deck because a 2-mana 3/3 is good stats anyway. And the fact that you can protect all of your other legendary creatures by sacrificing it is really, really big. So this could potentially mean that the Jodah Humans deck is actually viable in Explorer now. And additionally, I think this is also going to be a slam dunk include in Bard class decks as well. So Bard class, kind of an aggressive combo-ish deck as well. If you have the Bard class, you can kind of just pop off. And Bard class is very, very interested in having legendary creatures that just cost red-green, because once you activate the level 2 of it, they become free. And Hajar, again, just seems like a perfect addition to that deck, because if you have Bard class, skip to level 2, this becomes free, and then you can use it to protect all of your other legendary creatures as well. So this seems like a really good addition to those sorts of decks. Next up, we've got Swiftfoot Boots, 2-mana artifact, and you can equip it for 1, and equip creature has hexproof and haste. So this seems, you know, there's a lot of equipment in the Retro Artifact set. This is another one from the Retro Artifact set again, by the way, so it's not going to be legal in Explorer, but this seems like one of the more playable equipments out of this set because it gives hexproof. I think the ability to give something hexproof for 1 mana is pretty powerful. The first deck that comes to mind that might want this is Auras. You know, the ability to just give your core Spirit Dancer or SRAM hexproof, and it just sticks around on the battlefield that you can use on creatures later in the game is pretty nice. The upside of giving it haste is pretty huge as well. You know, say you're later in the game, you cast the core Spirit Dancer, equip Swiftfoot Boots, and then just put a bunch of auras on it. You could potentially just one-shot the opponent out of nowhere with a hasty attack, which is pretty nice. Now, the big downside of this is that it does give the opponent an opportunity to interact with your creature. You know, unlike Selfless Savior or Slip Out the Back or Karametra's Blessing that you can use in response to a removal spell, this does mean, you know, you cast your core Spirit Dancer, you try to equip the Swiftfoot Boots, and the opponent could try and kill it there, but it's a card that's worth bearing in mind. You know, in auras, it does also draw you a card off SRAM as well, but in general, it doesn't have to go in auras. If you're running a deck that is just looking to protect individual creatures, this could see play. Again, you know, the weakness is that it does give the opponent a point of interaction, but I think it's a card that's definitely worth bearing in mind. Next up, we've got Teething Wormlet. So this is a 1-mana 1/1, and it has Death Touch as long as you control 3 or more artifacts. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life, and if this is the first time this ability is resolved this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So this is a card that I think definitely has potential to see play in Explorer or Historic if you're running an aggressive artifact deck in green, which doesn't really exist at the moment, but I think the first place that I'm fairly excited for this card is in Hardened Scales. So in Historic, Hardened Scales has always felt like a deck that's powerful but not quite got there. And Hardened Scales in Historic is largely built around artifacts. I think the best +1/+1 counter synergies in Historic are built around artifacts, and I think Teething Wormlet could fit alongside those sorts of decks pretty well. You know, it has the kind of Ingenious Smith effect where it gets 1+1/+1 counter each turn for the first artifact you play. It also has kind of like a Prosperous Innkeeper style effect where you gain a bunch of life with it as well. And for 1 mana, this seems like it has potential. Potentially once it gets Death Touch as well, once you have some artifacts in play. So I'm not sure whether Hardened Scales is going to be a deck, and the big drawback of this, if you're running an artifact-based version of Hardened Scales, is that it's not an artifact itself, so you could end up with awkward draws where you have multiple Teething Wormlets and not that many artifacts to trigger them, but I think this is definitely a powerful card on rate, so it's something worth bearing in mind. Another card that could potentially slot into Hardened Scales in Historic is, or even Explorer, is Yotian Dissident. So like I explained, most of the Historic Hardened Scales decks are built around artifacts, and this seems like a really nice payoff for those sorts of decks. So it's a 2-mana 1/1, and whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So, like I said, Historic Hardened Scales decks are mainly built around artifacts, so if you have this in play, every single artifact you get is going to get a +1/+1 counter. If you have a Hardened Scales in play, that's going to double the +1/+1 counters up as well. So this could potentially see play in a Hardened Scales deck. Again, I'm not really sure Hardened Scales is going to be good enough, but it's worth bearing these 2 cards in mind. Next up, we've got Third Path Iconoclast. Not sure how you say that one, but it's a 2-mana Human Monk. It's a 2/1, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token. So this is very reminiscent of Young Pyromancer. It does a very similar thing, but the fact that it triggers off non-creature spells in general rather than just instants or sorceries is pretty huge, and the fact that it also creates artifact creature tokens is pretty huge as well. So while this could slot into a spell slinger deck that's running a bunch of instants or sorceries, you know, you could run Young Pyromancer and Third Path Iconoclast together. I'm mainly excited for this in artifact decks because you can play this, every artifact you cast will create an artifact token, kind of similar to how Psy works. Now, the fact that this is 1 mana cheaper is pretty sick, you know, starting getting this effect. The drawbacks of it versus Psy is that Psy creates Thopters, which is particularly relevant if you're running Retrofitter Foundry, and the fact that Psy has 4 toughness is very relevant against red damage-based removal as well. So I'm not really sure this is going to see play instead of Psy for those reasons. And Young Pyromancer is already a card that doesn't see a ton of play, so I'm not 100% sure this is going to make it, but if you're interested in getting a high density of artifacts in play, and you're running a bunch of artifacts, I think this is definitely a powerful option that's worth considering. Next up, we've got Haywire Mite, 1 mana 1/1 artifact creature. When it dies, you gain 2 life, and you can pay green and sack it to exile target non-creature artifact or non-creature enchantment. So this just seems like a really powerful card on rate if you're running green and you want to be able to kill artifacts or enchantments at instant speed. Outland Liberator is already a card that sees a decent amount of play in sideboards of green decks, and this just seems, I don't know if it's entirely an upgrade because, you know, the Outland Liberator does have a bigger body. If it goes to night, you can start killing artifacts and enchantments for free. Now, granted, that doesn't happen very often. If the opponent is playing an artifact or enchantment deck, they're probably going to go out of their way to make sure it doesn't go to night, but this just seems like a really decent replacement for that sort of effect if you want it in green, and the fact that it also provides some amount of incidental life gain is pretty nice as well, and it's an artifact itself, which could be relevant if you're running an artifact deck. Next up we've got Recruitment Officer. This is a 1-mana 2/1 human soldier, and you can pay 4 to look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card with mana value 3 or less from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this just seems like another really good option for the human 1-drop slot. The fact it's a 2/1 is really nice, it's very aggressively slanted. And these sorts of 1-drops that are good on turn 1 and give you some sort of ability later in the game are pretty good. Now, granted, especially in Historic, there are a lot of good options at the 1-drop slot, but I could see this seeing play that, being a 2/1 instead of a 1/2 versus something like Thraben Inspector is something that's particularly relevant. Now, again, Thraben Inspector gets you the value immediately, whereas you have to pump the 4 mana into this to get value off it later in the game. So I'm not really sure it makes the cut, but it's definitely worth bearing in mind, especially for Explorer, where you have less options for the 1-drop slot. Next up we've got Mesmeric Orb. So this is another card that's from the Retrofame artifact set. 2-mana artifact, and whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller mills a card. So the first place that I was thinking about this card is in Mill. So Mill is a deck in Historic specifically that has had a few pretty good additions recently. You've got Glimpse the Unthinkable, which mills the opponent for 10. You've got Founding the Third Path, which works as extra mill and as a way to flashback spells. But mill in Historic has always felt like a deck that just doesn't have enough quality mill pieces to make it consistent enough. And Mesmeric Orb, if you can get this down on turn 2, you can mill a lot of cards off this. So this does have the potential to improve the overall quality of the amount of mill cards that you can run in a mill deck. Now, I'm not sure that's going to be good enough to make mill viable, because I think the main 2 issues with Mill is, like I said earlier, Historic is a pretty aggressive format right now. So for Mill to be able to survive against a deck like Is It Wizards or Red-White Thopses, you do need to be running a decent amount of interaction to not just get run over by those sorts of decks. And I have seen an uptick of Phoenix decks over the past week. It had some pretty decent results in tournaments recently, and I think Phoenix is basically an auto loss for Mill unless you have Graveyard Hate. So even if Mesmeric Orb does improve the Mill decks, I'm not sure they're going to be that competitively viable in general. One other place you could look to run this card is in a self-mill deck. Now, self-mill decks generally aren't that good because in best of 3 because everyone's running Graveyard Hate, but in best of 1, you might be interested in running this in like a Reanimator strategy, for example. Although having said that, the big downside of running Mesmeric Orb in best of 1 is if you queue into another Graveyard-based deck like a Greasefang or a Dragonstorm deck, it's also going to mill the opponent, which is probably going to help them as well, which is less than ideal. So not 100% sure on that, but I think this could potentially see play in mill decks and Historic potentially. Next up we've got Portal to Phyrexian. This is a 9-mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices 3 creatures, and at the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It's a Phyrexian in addition to its other types. So this is a really, really powerful artifact if you can cheat it into play early. And this is kind of reminiscent of Godpharaoh's Gift, which is a card that did see play in Historic quite a long time ago. But I think this is significantly better than Godpharaoh's Gift, where it's definitely worth considering as a payoff. So the fact that it forces the opponent to sacrifice 3 creatures when it enters the battlefield is huge, and the fact that you get the reanimation every single turn is also pretty sick. So the main ways that you're really looking to reanimate this is with stuff like Refurbish or maybe Trash for Treasure. This is going to be quite a hard card to build around. Your deck is going to be vulnerable to Graveyard Hate. I don't think there's really a good way to cheat this into play that doesn't involve the graveyard. If you run Indomitable Creativity, for example, then it won't really work because you would have to not run any creatures in order to consistently hit this off Creativity, so you wouldn't get any value off the reanimation. So I think the only real way you can cheat this into play is using the graveyard, which does make you weak to Graveyard Hate, and you'd also have to have, even if you do cheat it into play, the continued value you get off it is also from the graveyard. So even if you get this into play, force the opponent to sack 3 creatures, if they then play Rest in Peace, it basically shuts off the reanimation ability. So maybe this is a card that sees play in best of 1, but you'd also need to be running creatures that you would want to reanimate. So whilst it is a powerful card, I'm not sure exactly how you would build a deck around it really, but it's definitely powerful enough that it's worth mentioning, I think. And next up we've got Rootwire Amalgam. So this is a 5-mana artifact creature which has prototype, which means you can pay it for 2 mana, but it's a 2/3 instead. And then you can pay 5 mana and sacrifice it to create an XX colorless golem artifact creature token, where X is 3 times its power. It gains haste until the end of turn, activate only as a sorcery. So the only place that I'm really excited for this is Fires of Invention Karuga decks in Explorer. So Fires of Invention isn't really viable in Historic at all because they rebalanced it to 5 mana, and I think it's basically unplayable at 5 mana. But in Explorer, I think 4 mana Fires of Invention is one of the most powerful cards in the format. And recently, you know, the last deck I posted on the channel was a Karuga Fires of Invention deck. I think Karuga is such a powerful card, and this seems like a card that is pretty nice with Karuga because it counts as 5 mana, so it still works within the Karuga companion restriction, but you can cast it for 2 mana as a 2/3, which is a pretty good roadblock against aggressive decks. You know, Karuga is always a deck that's looking for more cards that you can play earlier in the game, and it has a pretty nice activated ability, which is something that Fires of Invention decks want as well. You know, the big advantage of Fires of Invention decks is that you get to still have access to all of your lands in order to pump your mana into. So if you end up running green in a Karuga Fires of Invention deck, this acts as a turn 2 play, which is really nice with Karuga. And then later in the game, once you have Fires of Invention, it's also a mana sink that you can use with your mana. You know, you could blink it with Touch the Spirit Realm to reset it to a 5/5, then activate to turn it into a 15/15, and if you have it alongside Kenrith, you can give it Trample. So this is definitely an interesting card for Fires of Invention. Again, I'm not really sure it'll make the cut personally because there aren't that many other big incentives to be in green in Fires really, but it's an interesting option, so I'll definitely be testing it in Fires decks, and it's one to keep an eye on, I think. Next up, we've got Bitter Reunion. So this is a 2-mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards, and you can pay 1 and sack it to give creatures you control haste until the end of turn. So I'm mainly excited for this in 2 different decks. First of all is Enigmatic Incarnation, because especially in Explorer, where we don't have access to, I think it's Nylea's Presence that turns all of your lands into all land types, which enables you to cast Leyline Binding for 1 mana. I feel like one of the biggest lacking points in that deck, especially if you're running the 80-card Yorion builds, is that you don't have great options at the 2-drop slot. You know, you've obviously got Omen of the Sea and Urban Utopia, but the quality of the card draw effects at the 2-drop slot kind of drop off after that. You know, I've been running some builds with Rune of Sustenance that you can blink and re-equip to Yorion, but that's pretty lackluster. This card, on the other hand, is pretty nice because it draws you 2 cards, so it gets you even closer to your Incarnation and your Fires of Invention and stuff, and the ability to then give your creatures haste later in the game seems pretty nice. Another place I could potentially see it play is in Madness decks in Historic. You know, that's a deck where you've already got fairly decent ways to discard. You know, you've got Faithless Looting, Seasoned Pyromancer, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, but you don't really have great ways to discard on 2 mana, and I think the ability to give your creatures haste would be particularly relevant in a deck like that, because it's kind of an aggressively slanted deck, so giving all of the creatures that you play that turn haste seems really relevant in a Madness deck, so this could potentially see play in those 2 decks. Next up, we've got Transmogrant's Crown, 2 mana artifact equipment. A crit creature gets +2/+0, and whenever a crit creature dies, draw a card, and then you can either equip it for 2 colourless or a black. Now, this is a card that I'm not 100% sure we'll see play, but I think it's powerful enough that it's worth talking about. So the main place I could see this seeing play is in sacrifice decks. You know, if you're playing Explorer and you could run this as a one-of, you can just equip it to something like a Cauldron Familiar before you sacrifice it to a Witch's Oven and draw a card every single time you cycle that. You know, same thing with Onikol Anvil. You could equip it to an Anvil token and sacrifice it. So could potentially see this as a one-of in something like Explorer Sacrifice, but again, I'm not really 100% sure because there are a lot of other great options you can be running in that deck, like Diabolic Intent that I talked about earlier. Next up, we've got Calamity's Wake, 2 mana instant, exile all graveyards, and players can't cast non-creature spells this turn, then exile Calamity's Wake. So this is a really powerful effect. You know, Graveyard Hate and kind of a silence effect are both desirable against certain decks. Now again, there aren't really decks in Explorer or Historic right now where this is powerful, but I could definitely see this being an important card at shutting off like combo decks or just more powerful graveyard synergy decks in future. So I don't think this will see play anytime soon, but it's definitely worth bearing in mind for future. And then the last card I want to talk about is Dreams of Steel and Oil, 1 mana sorcery, target opponent reveals their hand, you choose an artifact or creature from it, then choose an artifact or creature from their graveyard, exile the chosen card. So typically these discard effects that don't hit non-creature spells aren't really commonly played. You know, discard spells in general are at their best against combo and control, and so discard spells that only hit creatures, discard spells that only hit artifacts generally aren't that great, but this card in particular is very strong against Greasefang. So for the purposes of Explorer, if you're a black deck and you really want to improve the Greasefang matchup, this seems pretty good because you can, you know, potentially get a Greasefang from their hand and exile a Parhelion or an Esseka's Chariot or something from their graveyard. So if you're playing a black deck and you want to improve the Greasefang matchup, this seems like a good tool as well. But anyway, that's all the cards that I saw and I thought could potentially see play in Explorer and Historic. If you think I've missed any, you know, if you think there are potential other ones that could see play, definitely let me know in the comments, because I'd love to hear, you know, I never know when I've potentially missed stuff. So if you think there's any that I've missed, definitely let me know in the comments. Would love to chat with you guys about that. If you think I missed any potential applications of cards that I already talked about, definitely let me know as well. And just in general, let me know what you think of the set, because I'm pretty excited for it, especially in Historic, where we get all these Retro Fame artifacts being added to the format. So anyway, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you got any questions about the set, if you got any comments about the cards that I talked about at all, definitely let me know in the comments, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Big up.